Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room. In this video, I wanted to talk to you about the question of INFJ genius, and I suppose more precisely, what is INFJ genius and how does it compare to other forms of genius? In the first instance, I think that we need to have a look at what genius means, because genius is not such an easy term to understand. Is it purely quantitative criterion, having an IQ above 140, for example, or 130? In other words, is it just another word for extreme giftedness? Or is it something else, something more qualitative? I think that a strong argument can be made for the fact that genius is more of the qualitative kind. What has an individual done in a particular field that is in another dimension compared to the rest of the discipline? Something that, almost stands on its own and for which there are few or maybe no standards of comparison. Now, I prefer this latter definition because at least it gives genius a meaning that is distinct from simply very high intelligence, as measured by IQ tests more specifically. I think that it's more interesting to give genius this more, in a sense, this more organic dimension. Genius as something that is expressed in a particular field where an individual stands out as exceptional, whatever the field might be. It's also good because, and better than the definition of genius, which merely measures, how you would score an IQ test, because it correlates with the use of the word genius that we resort to in our everyday language. I'm a strong believer that there's a lot of truth that you can uncover from the mere manner in which you use your everyday language. Now, we would be tempted to call Messi a genius, to call Zidane a genius. We'd be tempted to call Usain Bolt a genius. We'd be tempted to call Prince, the musician Prince, a genius. And I could use examples from a lot of other fields which are not immediately associated with IQ. Now, it's very possible that Usain Bolt or Messi, Zidane, or Prince have exceptionally high IQs, but it's so possible that they do not. It's possible that their numerical intelligence and that their verbal intelligence are average or above average, but not so high as to score 140 IQ points. And yes, there is a strong sense, I think, in which they are geniuses in the sense in which I try to articulate it. And I think that in this respect, what you notice immediately is that the question is not so much in what, types are the genius concentrated and where does the INFJ type fit in that picture. Is it number 2, number 3, number 4? Often is number 3, something like that. When using the quantitative approach. But when you consider genius in its more qualitative dimension, its more organic local dimension in a sense, well, that becomes meaningless in a way because you can be a genius at anything you're good at. And in fact, you could be, I think you could even argue that some people are, geniuses at making things, building things, logistics. There's so many ways to be exceptional. There are the ways that are more advertised, the ways that are more prestigious, such as the sciences or the arts, and then there are the ways that are seen as everyday, part of the everyday. But nevertheless, within that field, there will be people who are truly exceptional at what they do, and so exceptional that there is no standard of comparison, and as a result of which, it might be accurate to call them geniuses. And I think that if we use the quantitative approach to identify where do INFJs stand in this hierarchy, you're going to find yourself with the same relatively boring studies that suggest that per 100 INFJs there's an X percentage of INFJs that are gifted. So say IQ above 130, let's say. Now the evidence for these numbers is, of course, very dubious. Dubious not only because we don't exactly know how the IQ was measured, what the test was like, was it all the same test for everyone, but more straightforwardly, we're not even sure that these people were correctly typed, and that's a big issue, because as I've tried to explain in previous videos, sometimes people assume that it's easy to identify your type, but in a lot of cases it's not easy at all. It's quite hard, and you have to overcome a number of obstacles, and in the end what you get is a boring quantitative indicator that may not have a lot of meaning. Now in the case of the qualitative approach, which I advocate for certainly more, it's interesting when you look at history and you look at where it is that INFJs tend to stand out, tend to have the higher number of geniuses or people who could be claimed to be geniuses. It seems to me that there are two main fields where two main very broad fields where we see the higher numbers of INFJ geniuses. And it's not the sciences. Of course, there are INFJ geniuses in the sciences, but they're relatively rare, even when you factor in the rarity of the type itself. You're much more likely to see INFJ geniuses in literature and the arts. And when I say the arts, obviously literature is a kind of art, but I mean more arts such as cinema. In cinema, you see a lot of INFJ geniuses. It's quite striking. And you see a lot of INFJ geniuses in literature as well. People who stand out. People who stand out like Hermann Hesse or Dostoevsky or Leo Tolstoy. That's quite strong. And there's a good case to be made for James Joyce as well. In cinema, you see INFJ geniuses both on the side of the filmmakers and the actors. Among actors, you have Al Pacino, you have Daniel Day-Lewis, and many other ones, I'm sure. And on the side of the filmmakers, you have Andrei Tarkovsky, if you're familiar with him. You have Ingmar Bergman, if you're familiar with him. I mean, these are two huge names, and they're quite likely to have been INFJs. So they're well represented. Now, I forgot about an important discipline also, and it's separate. In philosophy, Plato, Schopenhauer, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Baruch Spinoza. These are huge names. These are very influential thinkers. INFJ as well. So they're very highly represented in philosophy, in filmmaking, cinema, on both sides, on the actor's side and on the director's side. And they're also represented in the arts, in the arts, in the letters, I should say, in literature. So philosophy, cinema, literature. That's kind of where I see the concentration of INFJ geniuses. They can belong to many other fields, but this is where I see them most represented. Now, I could try to understand why that's the case, but I think that the explanation would probably just be similar to what I usually say or usually give as an explanation. Those are likely conduits for the expression of a unique vision by means of the expression of universal values, NIFE. So cinema, good conduit for that, literature, but also philosophy and the embrace of original new philosophies. So if the highest level of originality of those functions can be expressed by those means, you're likely to have a genius once in a while. Not very often, but once in a while. It might be a bit more difficult to express a highly original and uncommon use of NIFE when it comes to building a house, for example, or playing football. But when it comes to the art of representation, such as cinema or literature, or the art of theorizing representation, such as philosophy, that's where they can thrive. But it's a massive field, and it would deserve probably a lot more analysis to kind of try to understand why INFJs tend to appear there. But I think there's a link there with representation and the opportunity for use of symbolism, using signs. Representation of the world is done by means of signs, and the signs is something that can be manipulated, virtuosically, I think, by means of NI, FE and TI. And I think that's the original part of genius, because this is something that I had not mentioned, something that is different, something that is just unlike anything else, and not captured at all by IQ. The originality inherent in genius has to reside within NIFE for an INFJ primarily, and to invest NIFE by means of the representation of the world, whether in artistic expression or in conceptualization, is something that is quite ideal for them. But let me know what you think, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Ciao.